Hi all, my name is Nita Baum, and for those who don't know me, I'm the founder of Be Free. We have a vision to transform workplaces to healing spaces that center humanity and equity and have equitable and inclusive cultures that contribute to the well-being, sustainability, freedom, and prosperity of all people. And we're in the midst of a series on equity leadership, case stories, and this is the third in that series. So we share a perspective on what equity leadership is, and I'll share a little story that speaks to that perspective from our client work. And then I'll send you off with some insights to integrate into your own equity journey. Equity leaders practice being embodied and connected to our senses, our felt sense, and our lived sense of the world. In so doing, we awaken greater capacity and connection to our agency, our power, and use our head, heart, and hands in service of creating greater well-being for all. A couple of years ago, I was working with the CEO of an organization that had recently experienced a conflict that was mounting and building over the course of several months related to the departure of Black staff in the organization. There were employees who were also people of color who identified a pattern of bias and racism that they felt was systemic and integral to the organization around the departure of Black staff. And so the CEO of this company reached out to me to support their work. And when she did, she was in a state that was fairly frenetic. She spoke to feeling overwhelmed. She spoke to the state of her nervous system and just feeling wired at times and really exhausted at other times and just feeling maxed out, really. And it was visible and palpable in our conversations. She was edgy. She felt like, to me, like she was rushing at times. And I could tell that it was impacting the way she was making sense of the circumstance. And part of what happened was the employees in the company started sharing what was happening with the conflict externally in conversation with partners of the organization, as well as with clients of the organization. And that obviously ramped up the stakes. In part, they did that because they didn't feel that they were being responded to effectively within the organization. So some of the first set of actions I took were to talk about embodiment. And in order to do that, I'm going to pause for a moment and share my screen so I can share with you what I shared with this CEO. So this work I'm about to share comes from a body of work called Polyvagal Theory, which is the work of a neuroscientist named Stephen Porges and his team. And it's extremely useful in the work that we do around equity, in part because, as many of you may have experienced, conflict in this space feels very charged, and it becomes difficult to move away from our history of polarization and our legacy of having extremely difficult conversations that often don't go anywhere or lead to actions that feel responsive in our country as a whole, and whenever we do talk about this issue. And so often we don't actually address the issues of race and equity. And that's another reason it's really challenging and charged when we do. So this body of work called Polyvagal Theory, one of the concepts in it is called neuroception. And what neuroception means is our nervous systems are detecting cues in our environment, including from people we're in relationship with, before we're cognitively aware of those cues. So we're looking for things like the sound or the prosody, the tone of somebody's voice. We're looking at their jaw, their facial expressions, the movement of their bodies. And we're looking at that in order to build trust and sense into our level of trust around the person. One of the facets of polyvagal theory that really strikes me is that we're actually making sense of the world through our bodies first. So our sense making begins in the way that our soma, our bodies, is beginning to build our awareness of a given situation, a given relationship, a given person. So that's huge, because we often think of our sense making as something that's connected to our cognition, which we usually think is like our brains, our heads. And in fact, if you think about it, when we're babies, we're pre-verbal, and yet we're beginning to make sense of the world. And so one of the ways, the first ways we're making sense is through our bodies, through our senses. There are 3 states in polyvagal theory, and actually there are 4, but 2 of them are connected to the sympathetic nervous system. So those states are fight and flight. There is the freeze state, and there's social engagement. And what I shared with the CEO was that when we are in fight or flight, there's some really fascinating neurophysiological, so nervous system and somatic experiences, or mind-body experiences, that we have. One is that that is a state that is pro-survival, which is to say it really readies us for being able to react very quickly, to move quickly. So for example, if a lion is coming at us or a bus is coming at us, we can jump out of the way or begin to run away. And that is associated with the flight. If somebody is threatening our lives, we are in a stance where we're alert. Our bodies get ready for quick movement to engage with the person, to defend ourselves. So it's this pro-survival state is also a defensive state that is receiving the signals and information in the environment as threatening. Then there's the freeze state. So the freeze state is one in which we feel a sense of overwhelm. And in day-to-day life, this looks like conservation of energy or feeling shut down, depression. Sometimes it's the state in which we get connected to our sense of shame. And then the third state is social engagement. And that's a state which evolutionarily in us developed later in our lives. And that's a state in which we have a greater capacity for lateral and divergent thinking. We have the capacity to slow down, be more present, be grounded, and it affects our ability to communicate. Because we can slow down, we can communicate more clearly, we can relate with others, feeling a greater sense of trust. And one of the most fascinating things about it to me is we can hold multiple seemingly irreconcilable ideas concurrently at the same time. So that certainly has an impact in the way we're both making sense as well as making decisions when we're in different states. The last thing I'll share is all of these states serve a purpose. And there's research that shows that transformational leaders with the capacity to engage with complexity, chaos, and high levels of discomfort are able to have more capacity to self-regulate in each of these states. They also have more capacity to support others when they're in these states, which is really useful under duress. So I'm going to stop this share. And so the implications of that, as I was sharing it with this CEO of this company, were being embodied, being connected to your lived and felt sense is one of the vehicles through which you can really become present and aware about the quality of your decision making. How much are you relying on the lens of fight, flight, or freeze to make sense of what is happening, and what is the story that arises from that? How much are you in a more grounded state, and what is the story that arises from that? And so because she was self-identified as moving between fight, flight, and freeze in the course of her reaction to this circumstance that happened, she realized that one of her instincts, which is so natural for many of us, was to want to shut the whole thing down. How do I avoid it, turn it away, and very quickly respond and just get rid of it? Rather than do that, in order to both grow her capacity and her ability to respond, which you can think of as responsibility, the ability to respond rather than simply react, both of which serve a purpose, but in this case, to be more responsive within the organization, to prevent escalation, and to really engage with people who had valid and legitimate concerns. It took moving from the fight, flight, freeze, and the reactions to that into this other state. And so we spent some time working on her embodiment. I encouraged her to relax, to drink water, to take time to slow down, to exercise, and to take a break, which is also really hard to do when we're in these frenetic states, because all of these states are self-perpetuating for many of us. And over the course of about a week, the decision was to engage in conversation and dialogue with the team. We went through a couple of learning and healing sessions together. And at the end of that, her sense making was really different. And one of the comments she shared with me was, not only was her sense making, her decision making feeling more grounded to her, she also recognized that being more embodied allowed her to turn toward discomfort, to engage with conflict in ways that felt more generative, to actually move toward connection through the discomfort instead of in spite of it. And she felt better physically. And so being embodied attunes us to our actual needs. Like, what do I need when I'm in a moment of fight or flight? Often you don't need to leave it. You actually just need to sit with it and sit with the information that it's trying to provide you. Those states have a lot of wisdom in them, but most of the time, because we want to avoid them or shut them down, we're not able to access that wisdom. That's part of why we practice embodiment with the leaders we work with on equity leadership. So I won't share too many more insights because I think a lot of them were embedded in the CEO's experience herself, but embodiment enables three things. It helps us take better care of our well-being. It helps us to lean into discomfort and respond effectively, including through decision-making and more effective communications, thereby allowing us to connect with people. And it improves the actual quality of our decision-making because we're able to take in more information as we're making sense. So if this is interesting to you, I suggest you consider practices that would support your own embodiment. For some people, that looks like yoga or meditation. How do you just get into your body so that you're more capacitated? You're not just using your head, but you're using more of your potential, right? And part of this is grounded in the idea of the mind-body connection. Our minds are not just in our heads, as we so typically think, but in fact, we have a bigger brain in our gut. You know, many people talk about a gut sense or a gut intuition. Well, that's connected to the fact that we have many more nerve endings in a sense and a bigger brain in our gut than we do in our heads, literally. So food for thought for all of you. Practice embodiment as part of your capacity to engage in more charged conversations, and welcome your comments and responses. Thanks for being on this journey together.